Imagine a world where, in the 1st century AD, the Roman sky is not choked by the yellow smog of funeral pyres, but by the towering chimneys of gargantuan factories. Imagine flawless paved roads, which we are used to seeing under the hooves of cavalry, echoing with the clatter and hiss of steam-powered heavy freight platforms. Picture steel cargo ships unloading in the ports of Ostia, while senators in togas debate not just the price of Egyptian grain, but the stock prices of coal mines in misty Britain. Does this sound like a mad steampunk fantasy? In reality, it is the most terrifying missed opportunity in human history. The Roman Empire had absolutely everything it needed to launch an industrial revolution 18 centuries before James Watt ever did. They had the world's greatest engineers, access to vast mineral resources, and, most importantly, working prototypes of steam engines. But why did great Rome, the conqueror of 3 continents, remain stuck in the age of muscle power? Why, instead of sending the first man to the moon sometime around the year 400, did the empire prefer to slowly rot until it was trampled by barbarians who couldn't even read? The answer lies in one of the most effective and simultaneously deadliest traps in economic history. A trap so comfortable that the Roman elite voluntarily walled up the future of an entire civilization within it. Traditionally, we are told that Rome's greatness came from its legions. We see the steel ranks, the discipline, and the genius of Julius Caesar, who conquered Gaul in 9 years, expanding the boundaries of the world to unprecedented limits. We are told about law, roads, and aqueducts. It seems like a civilization geared for endless progress. After all, it was in Alexandria, Egypt, the jewel of the empire, that a man named Hero lived in the 1st century AD. This ancient genius created the Aeolipile, the world's first steam engine. It was a device that converted steam energy into mechanical motion. It was the true engine of the ancient world. Hero of Alexandria was no mere theorist or armchair dreamer. He created automatic temple doors operated by complex systems of hydraulics and counterweights, programmable robots for theatrical performances that moved along set paths, and even the first vending machines that dispensed holy water. The Romans knew how to build sophisticated water mills. In Barbegal, in southern France, archaeologists discovered an entire flour factory consisting of 16 water wheels arranged in a cascade, capable of feeding an entire city. The technical foundation was completely ready. Iron, copper, coal, all of this was mined on a giant industrial scale in Spain and Britain. Yet, Hero's Aeolipile remained a curious toy, shown by patricians to guests at banquets to entertain them between courses of peacock tongues and the drinking of Falernian wine from the vintage of 121 BC. Here lies the first paradox. In a modern economy, any invention that increases labor efficiency is a golden ticket to the future. In Rome, however, any technology capable of replacing a human with a machine was perceived as a direct threat to state security and social stability. There is a legend about a man who came to the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 AD. The inventor brought a cup made of flexible glass, vitrum flexile, that was impossible to break. He expected a great reward, but Tiberius asked only one question: does anyone else know the secret of this production? Upon receiving a negative answer, the emperor ordered the master's immediate execution and the destruction of his workshop. The ruler's logic was chillingly cynical. If glass became unbreakable, gold and silver would lose their value, and the empire's financial system, based on the scarcity of metals, would instantly collapse. But the main reason for the stagnation was much larger and more systemic. Its name was slavery. Rome was a state built on living tools. After Octavian Augustus ended the bloody civil wars and established the Principate in 27 BC, the empire turned into a gigantic pump for siphoning human resources. After every triumphant campaign by generals like Emperor Trajan, who in 106 AD finally conquered Dacia and seized the vast treasures of King Decebalus, hundreds of thousands of slaves were dumped onto the empire's slave markets. Captives cost next to nothing. Why would a wealthy landowner in Campania or a mine owner in Asturias invest massive amounts of money in developing, testing, and maintaining a complex steam pump when he could buy 10 strong Thracians or Gauls for a pittance? Slavery created a monstrous economic anomaly. Intellect became cheaper than muscle. In 18th century Britain, coal was expensive to mine, and labor was scarce and organized, forcing entrepreneurs to invest in Newcomen steam engines. In Rome, labor was infinite, renewable, and utterly without rights. When slaves became too numerous, human life devalued to the point that innovation simply became economically unviable. Why build a crane when you can force 500 prisoners of war to drag a single block of marble to the point of exhaustion? There was, however, a second, deeper layer to this trap, the political one. It was the existential fear of the elite toward surplus people. Roman power rested on a fragile and dangerous balance. A huge number of free Roman citizens, the plebeians, had no steady work. They lived on state welfare, the regular free distribution of grain known as the annona. Emperors of the Flavian dynasty, like Vespasian, who ruled in the 70s AD, understood perfectly. If you replace the hard labor of workers with efficient machines, what will millions of bitter, idle, and hungry people do? Once, during the reconstruction of Rome following the fires of Nero's era, an engineer proposed a mechanism to quickly transport heavy columns to the Capitoline Hill. Vespasian refused to pay the inventor, stating famously, "Let me feed my poor commons." This was a deliberate political decision. The authorities consciously blocked technological progress to maintain social order. They bought the loyalty of the masses by artificially preserving the need for their grueling, inefficient labor. In their eyes, innovation was synonymous with revolution. The Roman elite preferred extensive growth, seizing new lands, new slaves, and new resources over the intensive development of technology. The stakes began to rise rapidly in the 2nd century, the so-called Golden Age of the 5 good emperors. Rome's economy reached its visible peak, but this peak was an illusion. The empire wasn't growing through increased productivity, it was inflating like a bubble through expansion. But as soon as the legions hit the Scottish Highlands in the north, the German forests on the Rhine, and the endless deserts in the east, the flow of cheap slaves began to dry up. The borders stabilized under Hadrian between 117 and 138 AD, and that is when the hidden crisis began. The moment had come where they either had to transition to machines or begin a slow death. The resource-based model of the economy began to fail, a failure that could no longer be hidden behind the glitter of marble forums. And here we reach the climax of the entire Roman tragedy. In 165 AD, during the reign of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius, legions returned from eastern campaigns against Parthia, bringing with them not only trophies, but the Antonine Plague. The epidemic wiped out up to a third of the empire's population. Labor became catastrophically scarce. Fields stood unharvested, mines stopped, and the price of labor skyrocketed. This was it, the perfect historical moment for a great industrial leap. It was under exactly these conditions in England, 1,500 years later, that people began building the first mechanical looms. But Rome once again chose the path of degradation and coercion. Instead of investing in engineers, schools, and mechanisms to compensate for the population loss, the empire began to tighten the screws. It was during this period that the processes began which would later lead to serfdom.
Emperors began issuing brutal edicts, tying people for life to their professions and places of residence. The son of a blacksmith was forced, under penalty of death, to become a blacksmith. The son of a tenant farmer had to remain on his master's land. The authorities tried to forcibly stop the march of time and freeze an economy that was crumbling before their eyes. Engineering thought, which could have created railroads and steam turbines, was finally diverted into building even more grandiose but useless monuments to imperial vanity. Diocletian, coming to power at the end of the 3rd century, tried to stop total inflation with his Edict on Prices in 301 AD, simply by banning them from rising under threat of execution. It was the final admission of the total intellectual bankruptcy of the Roman elite. The empire's education system also played a role in this civilizational collapse. The Roman aristocracy was trained exclusively in rhetoric, philosophy, and grammar. They despised mathematics, physics, and natural sciences, considering them the domain of base craftsmen and slaves. In the works of Cicero, Seneca, and Pliny, we find praise for agriculture and war, but contempt for trade and any mechanical labor. Knowledge in the Roman Empire was a status symbol used to preserve power, not to change the material world. While the bankers of the future Renaissance, such as the Medici or the Fuggers, understood the direct link between investing in production technology and personal profit, Roman tycoons continued to sink surplus capital into land, more slaves, and luxury goods from China and India, draining currency out of the empire. The truth is that the Roman Empire could have become a civilization of the stars and the atom, but it consciously chose to remain a civilization of masters and slaves. The monstrous concentration of wealth in the hands of a few families meant that the vast majority of the population simply had no incentive to consume new goods, and producers had no incentive to create them. The empire's internal market suffocated from inequality and a lack of demand. When slaves became scarce and free citizens were turned into serfs, economic mobility vanished. Rome's social elevators turned into solid walls. The end was inevitable and incredibly brutal. The civilization that rejected steam engines in favor of living slaves eventually lost to barbarians who had neither technology nor gold, but had the will to live and an absence of bureaucratic shackles. The technological advantage of the legions gradually eroded as the production of high-quality weapons and armor degraded along with the economy. Provinces began to break away, taxes stopped being collected, and the army turned into a rabble of mercenaries. Hero of Alexandria's steam engine remained gathering dust in the libraries of Alexandria until they were burned by religious fanatics who viewed ancient knowledge as sinful madness. Humanity threw itself back 1,500 years simply because a handful of people at the top of the pyramid feared losing control over the crowd they had fed for centuries with free bread and entertained with bloody executions in the Colosseum. Instead of building railroads, the Romans built ever higher walls that ultimately failed to save them. This grandiose failure in history reminds us of the critical importance of economic incentive structures. The Romans possessed every single building block to create a modern, prosperous world, from flawless concrete and roads to the foundations of Roman private law and the seeds of steam power. However, they could not, or rather would not, assemble these elements into a working system of progress. To them, any radical innovation was a painful disturbance of eternal harmony, not a tool for survival. As a result, instead of locomotives, the shadows of the Great Migration crawled along the empire's roads, and the magnificent aqueducts became monuments to an age that knew how, but never understood why. This story is not just a melancholy tale of the distant past. It is a harsh warning to us today. Rome proved that the presence of technology itself means nothing if a society is paralyzed by fear of the future and critically dependent on the exploitation of a cheap resource, be it slave labor, fossil fuels, or something else. Today, we look at artificial intelligence, neural networks, and robotics with the same deep apprehension that Emperor Vespasian felt toward that ill-fated crane, the fear that they will deprive millions of people of work and destroy the social contract. But the fall of Rome teaches us the main lesson. Technological stagnation always costs a civilization 1,000 times more than any temporary upheaval caused by rapid progress. The price of a deliberate rejection of the future is always an inevitable fall into a new dark age. We could have walked on the surface of the moon as early as the Renaissance if the ancient world had risked taking a step toward steam and steel. Instead, humanity spent 2 agonizing millennia simply learning to do again what the great minds of Alexandria considered a mere toy for bored patricians. Civilization is not about monumental walls or gold in the treasury. It is, above all, a bold choice in favor of moving forward, no matter how unpredictable or frightening it may seem. Rome could not make that choice, and its greatest technical legacy became only the foundation upon which, centuries later, other nations risked building a world of machines. The history of Rome is the echo of a revolution that never happened, the sound of a closing door behind which the future of all humanity was left.